Hey guys, so today I'm going to talk about how to do a lifestyle editing process. So in this case, we'll be editing this picture. This is the final version, but I'm going to take you step by step on how I would edit something like this that has a little bit more direct light. There's not as much going on, but it's not like a total studio type photo. So as you can see, there's quite a few things. But this is the original photo. And you want to create this starting here because this will help you determine which color profile you can use, as well as do some quick overall picture edits to help start off your editing process. So a lot of these edits you can do, or all of these edits you can do in Lightroom and then export into Photoshop as a smart object. But in this case, this is easier if you're going to do the bulk of your edits in Photoshop. So for me, I would definitely end up not touching temperature or tint, just because that's something I will edit later on. But I don't like necessarily like my highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So in this case, as you can see, these are edits I've already done to the photo. And so I've definitely reduced my highlights, increased my shadows up to my whites a smidgen, and lowered my blacks a little bit. As for color profile, you can check the browse option, and this will give you all of the built-in color options. These are all Adobe, but sometimes it helps to go into camera matching, and then you can see how much that changes your photo. And this will determine what your starting point is. But in my case, standard looks pretty good, so you could choose that one. I ended up sticking with Adobe Color. And so from there, I'm just gonna open image. So in this case, the first thing that I would want to do is work on the skin edits. And for this case, it's best to work non-destructively for your photos, which means you're not editing the original photo in case you ever want to go back and change it completely. You know, you never know in the future, so it's best to do non-destructive editing. So in this case, I have created a whole separate layer called Skin Edits, and you can just click this button in the bottom for Create New Layer. And so in this case, let me turn all these off so I can show you. Oh, I have one more. So this is what it looks like with all my edits, just for the skin. And so you can see it's not perfect, but this one kind of gives you like the original starting point for how you can start building upon this. And so when you create this layer, it's very, very important that you end up once you click this button here, which is going to be your healing brush tool, which is one of the most important tools you can have. You make sure that current and below is selected. So this way, even though you're editing on your skin edits layer, you will be affecting everything below. And so in this case, if you see, one way to check is, let me create a separate layer. And then I'm going to have my healing brush. I'm going to really zoom in, and as you can see, my skin's not that great, which is perfect practice. And so what you want to do is you want to click Option and click on a spot that is relatively like pretty clean in terms of skin, and that would be your sourcing. And then you can easily just click down, and then it will go along and just erase things that you don't like. And so one thing to note is that with the healing brush tool, it's always going to start off as long as you unclick, it's going to go back to where your original source was. So if you want to move it around, you're going to have to go like down here, and then it will just have a new source. And this is very important for whenever you are editing blemishes, because different textures on the skin will determine where you're going to source it from. So you can see here it's a lot more smooth and a little bit blurrier because of the camera. And then here it's a little bit more textured because this is what's in focus. So I'm just going to show you a couple more examples here. I'm going to make my size really, really small for my brush so I can really get in there and edit some fine point details. And you're going to go through and you're gonna just click around. So as you can see, it can take a really long time, but if you want to have a good edit, it's really important to do that. And so some other places that I would definitely go through and adjust are this stray hair, maybe even these ones if I have time. I would also go in and do all these little marks here, and I'll source from this area because there's a little more texture. I'll also clean up this dark spot as well, sourcing from around this area or here. It's going to be a little bit more of a rough edit, as well as some of these marks here. And getting rid of this stray hair just to clean up the image. And so once we do that, this is sort of what you're going to end up getting. From there, what I like to do is create a black and white layer, and all you have to do is go to adjustments, and it's gonna be this half black, half white, called black and white. And so this will really help you see the discolorations in your photo, that will determine where you want to dodge and burn. And so dodging and burning is really important because it's painting with light, and photography is all about that. And so from here, you can even adjust to make your black and white layer like more harsh, so you can really, really get down into the details. But this kind of shows you, okay, where is some discoloration here, as well as this whole area, and then here, as well as around my smile lines. So you can see there's a lot that can be adjusted to kind of even out the skin texture. And so what trick I really enjoy doing is I like to create 2 different layers using the curves tool. So I'm gonna click this, and to be able to paint with my dodging, I'm gonna click here up where the highlight section is, which is the brightest part of the photo, and then I'm gonna bring it up really, really high. And then in order for it to not affect your entire picture, it's important that you inverse this layer. So I'm on a Mac, and I will just do Command I to reverse. And so now it's only going to show up in the places where you paint with the paintbrush tool, and you want to make sure that it's between white and black here. So that way you're painting with white if you want to affect the image. So basically the parts where you want this layer to show up, and then black as an eraser essentially for the parts where you no longer want it to show. And so in this case, I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger just for this, it's too big, just for this example. And then, so I'm going to work on this area a bit. So now that it's inversed and we're working with the dodging section, we're just going to go through, oops, that's a little too high. I'm going to make my opacity at a 1, just so it's really, really subtle that you can build on it. And then I'm just going to paint through. Obviously, you want to be a little bit more delicate with like the areas that you're affecting. But for this sake of time, I'm just going to be a little more rough with it. And as you can see, it's generally lighting up. And so if you wanted to affect a little bit more, you can even bump it up to 3, and it'll be a more dramatic difference. So we're just really gonna get in there. You can see it's really making a difference. And this will take some time, but that's okay. That is normal. If you're doing a professional editing job, sometimes it will take you a really, really long time. And so you can see how much of a difference we have. And then in order to see in terms of what your actual picture is going to look like, you can uncheck the black and white layer and then kind of just toggle between. So huge difference, but you do want to be careful not to overdo it. So it helps to zoom out. every once in a while, just to kind of like toggle through and be like, okay, that looks really realistic, but there's still a lot more to do. So we're gonna affect these little areas, just really subtle, and some discoloration here. As well as here. But the main discoloration will be this chin area. Okay, so let's turn it off. Okay, it looks pretty realistic. Now we're gonna zoom out. You really wanna go for subtlety here. That is the key. Okay, so essentially once you do all of that, it's gonna take some time, but you see how much of a difference it is. And I do want to point out that I did affect as well some parts of my body, not just my face. And that's something you should not forget as a retoucher, is that you're also going to have to retouch the body to match the face. That is something a lot of people forget often, and that's not a good practice to have. So I definitely made sure to clean up here. There's some discoloration, as well as my neck. I would have gone in here, a little bit of my nose, so it's a little bit more even. I would have brightened my lips a little bit. Even the shirt as well, because it's a huge difference between the highlights and the shadows. It really helps to be able to go in and kind of even that out a little bit. And then later I would go in with the dodge tool and kind of darken these areas just a smidgen, just to like bring in back some of the detail. And as well as my hat, even my jewelry a little bit. I didn't do much with like my pants, but I think it's pretty well exposed here. So you're basically, as you can see, they have a lot of like edits here, so it does take some time, but there is a dramatic difference with the picture. So once you do that, you want to do the exact opposite, and you're going to make another adjustment layer with the curves, and you're going to bring down the highlights extremely, and you're going to reverse it. And in this case, you can see that I haven't affected as much. I just fixed the hair a little bit because it was a little overexposed. And then, like I said earlier, some of the highlights here. I didn't touch my skin too much just because I think it's a good place right now, but usually you will do both with the skin. And that's just kind of to bring it and make it all even. And so the next thing that I would do is I would turn off my black and white layer, and you can see there's a pretty big difference. I would then create a threshold layer, and what this does, it shows you where your highlights and your shadows are, but like the deepest center, the highest portion. So it's originally centered in the middle, but you want to create pinpoints of where these lights are going to be. So you're going to want to select eyedropper tool, but you're going to want to go to color sampler tool, and this is what's going to give you these little samplers here. So to select your shadows, you're going to carry this all the way to the end, and you want to see kind of essentially what is all left here. In this case, I chose this one because this point has a little bit more that I could choose from, and so I put my eyedropper there for one point. And then for the highlights, I did the opposite of what, as I went as far as I can tell. Okay, so all the way to the end, there's nothing left. So then I will work my way, and then I would see, okay, as long as I work my way back, where's the highest point of the highlights, and it's going to be this section. So I ended up choosing something that was a little bit more substantial, which is this little spot here. And then from there, once I have my eyedropper selected, I will delete my threshold layer, and I will create a levels layer. And so here's your threshold, and then here are your levels. So what this will help you do is improve your white balance. So you're going to select the white or the highlight dropper, and you're going to go into the very center, and you're going to select on it. And you're going to do the same thing with the dark part, and you're going to go to the darkest section, and you're going to select it. And so what that will do is, in this case, my photo is very well exposed, but this is very helpful if you're in a wonky lighting situation, or like the indoor lighting made your picture very yellow, and this will help fix that for you. But in this case, we didn't really do it, but it's a good practice to use. So these are all selective edits that I decided to do because I didn't like how my wall is like a little bit of like a weird shade of green. So what I ended up doing was I lightened it up and whitened it up a little bit by using the hue saturation tool. And so that's going to be right here in your adjustments tab. And so I ended up inversing it again. And I painted over all of the section that I wanted to affect with this layer using my brush tool and making sure it was on the white setting. And for this, if you really want to affect it, you're gonna have to get like really deep into it. So you're gonna want to use a really small brush and make sure you're highlighting here. As you can see, if you want to do a good job, you're gonna have to like really get down to the nitty-gritty. And so in order to adjust for it, I ended up lowering the saturation just a teensy bit, because if you do more, it looks very unrealistic. So I did not touch the hue section at all, because this is just going to make it into like these really weird colors that are also unrealistic. And I don't typically like to use this because it's very destructive type of editing, and overall it kind of like covers the whole section of color rather than making sure that it affects the section you're editing equally in a way that like shows dimension. It just kind of covers it all in the color. So it's not necessarily very good. But with the lightness, I ended up bumping it up just to make it a little bit brighter. Otherwise, see, you can see my draw wasn't perfect, but when it comes to making it brighter, you can't really tell. The next section that I did was I used selective color on the whole picture. And so selective color is going to be this little 4 triangle, looks like an envelope in your adjustments tab. And from here, I would then affect typically I only use my neutrals, my blacks, and my whites. I always start off with my neutrals and kind of work my way up to the darks and then to the whites. I rarely affect the whites, but in this case, because my shirt is taking on a lot of color from the surroundings, it needed to be adjusted a little bit. So in this case, I like to, for my neutrals, bump up to the right the blacks just a teensy bit. And you don't typically want to go over plus 10 or minus 10% for any of these, because then it starts to look really unrealistic, and you want to make it as subtle as possible. So in this case, I wanted to add a little bit of a contrast, a little bit of a punch, because I don't like using the actual contrast slider in Lightroom, because it affects it in a very wonky way that really bumps up your whites and it looks way over the top. So this is a little bit more of a subtle way to do it. I bumped it up a little bit, so the more you go to the right on the blacks, the deeper the color is going to be, and the more you go to the left, the more washed out it's going to be. So in this case, I bumped it up just a little bit, and so I'll show you where it was originally, and you can see just a little bit makes a huge difference, but you don't want to do too much, because then, like I said, you want to have subtle, effective work. My picture, I also made it a little bit more to the left on the yellows, because in this case, I thought it was a little too greenish. So I kind of wanted to like even it out, smoothen out the color. So it's got a little bit more of like a bluish tint. Magenta I didn't really touch, neither did cyan, and this is more of a personal preference. I just like to make it more true to what the reality was of the situation. In this case, it's a lot more even. For my blacks, in this case, I didn't touch them because the neutrals, in my opinion, did a good enough job. And then if you do want to do it, you see how much more of an impact it has. So that's why I was like, you know what? The neutral section is fine for this picture. But if you're editing something with food or it's a little bit more washed out, you do want to use your blacks. And in this pictures edit, I did affect the whites, like I said earlier. I made it go a little bit to the left on the blacks, just to kind of brighten it up a little bit. And same thing with the yellows to the left, because it was just having like this really weird green tint from the furniture. So I ended up kind of pushing it to the left to have a little bit more of like a neutral blue tint. My magenta, this is just a counteract for the same thing, but you can see like it's a very slight difference. And I don't typically touch my cyans, but in my opinion, this is pretty good. It gave it just enough punch. It used to be a little bit more of a green tint, but I ended up kind of neutralizing it, giving it a little bit more of a bold color, and that's where I typically recommend tweaking with those things. And then on Lightroom, you can do more of like stylistic elements with your HSL sliders, but this gives you more of like a deeper overall editing of your photo. And you can even do the other colors as well, but I typically leave that for Lightroom. So you can see pretty big difference to this point. And so the next thing that I decided to do was I decided to edit my skin separately, and it's very subtle, but I ended up doing a inverse of a selective color adjustment layer. And so that way I can just paint over the section I wanted to edit. And the reason I did this was because my skin was looking a little like yellow washed out. And so this kind of helped me neutralize it a smidgen. I went to my neutrals, kind of did a similar approach, but this is more of a personal preference. The next thing I did was my lips. And as you can see, I wasn't really wearing lipstick when I was taking this photo of myself, and this kind of helps you identify different layers you want to edit, and I try to make it a little bit more subtle, kept it still pretty natural, and I still did a selective color inverse layer and painted over the section I wanted to adjust. And I'm pretty sure I only played with the neutrals in this photo, or in this layer. Yes. And here, this is literally all personal preference, but I just painted over with a really small brush over my lips, try to keep it really subtle. Obviously made a little bit more magenta, just to give it that pink pop. So you can see it still looks really realistic, like I was wearing lipstick. And you can even do this trick with your eyes, with blush, with eyeshadow. You can really get into the details using these, and that's just my personal trick. And as you can see, I ended up grouping all of the layers into one group using this right here, and that way you can really see original photo to all your edits, and it's a lot more professional. It's cleaner, it's a little bit better exposed. So that is how you do a professional retouching job for a lifestyle photo. Obviously, if you do beauty, it's going to be a lot more detailed because you're really close into the face. There's a lot more details you have to account for. But for a lifestyle photo like this, or something more fashion-based, that's a little more casual, I would definitely take this like approach where I really make sure I separate the layers out. I edit each thing individually, and I don't edit the original photo, because if I ever want to go back and totally scrap this and have a new style and need to update my portfolio, I can totally do that. Or if you're doing it for a client and they don't like your original edits for some reason, this gives you the opportunity to be able to go back and adjust better way to match what your client is expecting. So if you have any questions, please make sure to leave in the comments below. And if you want to know how to export or whatever, just say so, and I can make a whole separate video about that. But that is all for today. Stay tuned for more video editing with me.